The morning of April 16, 1945. Radar Operator Second Class James Fahey crouched in the cramped Combat Information Center of the USS Montpelier, watching the green sweep of his scope paint the same story it had painted for 11 consecutive days. Contacts, dozens of them, closing from the north at 180 knots. The fluorescent blips moved with the steady, mechanical precision of aircraft under control, but Fahey knew what they represented wasn't mechanical at all. These weren't pilots trying to return home. These were men who had already written their final letters, already said their goodbyes, already stripped their cockpits of everything except fuel, explosives, and a photograph of the Emperor. The voice of the air defense officer cut through the red-lit darkness. Multiple bogies, bearing 3, 4, 5, range 20 miles. Designate all as probable kamikazes. In the 90 days between April 1st and the end of June 1945, during the Battle of Okinawa, American destroyers and cruisers faced the most sustained and psychologically devastating aerial assault in naval history. But those same 90 days would also witness what many historians now consider the most dramatic technological turning point in anti-aircraft warfare, a secret so closely guarded that soldiers who handled it daily weren't told. How it worked, a device so revolutionary that its deployment was restricted by direct order of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and a weapon whose very existence would be denied by the U.S. government until long after the war's end. The proximity fuse, officially designated the VT fuse, would prove so effective that in those 3 months it would help American gunners shoot down hundreds of Japanese aircraft, fundamentally alter the outcome of the Pacific War's final campaign, and save thousands of American lives. But the story of how this illegal technology came to be, and why it was kept more secret than even the atomic bomb for much of the war, begins not in the Pacific, but in the physics laboratories and proving grounds of a nation that, in 1940, was still at peace. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why the proximity fuse mattered, you must first understand the problem it solved. Anti-aircraft fire in the early years of World War II was a study in futility dressed up as mathematics. A gun crew engaging an aircraft flying at 300 miles per hour needed to calculate not where the target was, but where it would be in the 10 to 15 seconds it took for their shell to reach altitude. They needed to account for wind speed, air density, the shell's velocity decay, and the target's likely evasive action. Even with mechanical fire control computers themselves, cutting-edge technology, the probability of a direct hit on an aircraft with a conventional high-explosive shell was approximately 1 in 2,500. The only practical solution was the timed fuse. A gunner would set a mechanical timer on the shell, hoping to detonate it at the precise altitude where the enemy aircraft would be. If the calculation was perfect, the shell would explode within lethal distance, usually about 30 feet, and kill the aircraft with fragmentation. If the calculation was off by even a second, the shell would explode harmlessly in empty sky, adding nothing but noise to the battle. The problem became exponentially worse when the target wasn't trying to evade, but to impact. The kamikaze, the divine wind, represented a fundamental shift in aerial warfare. Beginning in October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy had institutionalized suicide attacks as standard doctrine. These weren't desperate acts by individual pilots. They were organized missions complete with ceremonial send-offs, specially modified aircraft, and tactical formations designed to maximize the chance that at least one plane would strike home. A conventional attacking aircraft might abort its run if met with heavy fire. A kamikaze wouldn't. A conventional bomber might veer away after releasing its payload. A kamikaze was the payload. From October 1944 through the end of the war, approximately 2,800 Japanese pilots would deliberately crash their aircraft into Allied ships, damaging or sinking more than 400 vessels and killing nearly 5,000 American sailors. The psychological weight of this warfare was immense. Sailors stood at their battle stations knowing that every aircraft on their radar might be piloted by someone already dead in spirit, someone for whom turning back wasn't an option. The only question was whether American shells could destroy the plane before the plane destroyed them. The mathematics was brutal. A typical heavy cruiser might carry 8 5-inch guns for anti-aircraft defense. Each gun could fire 15 rounds per minute. Against a single kamikaze approaching at 300 miles per hour, closing the distance at roughly 500 feet per second, the cruiser might have 90 seconds of engagement time, allowing each gun to fire perhaps 20 rounds. That meant 160 shells fired at a single target. With conventional timed fuses, even under ideal conditions with perfect fire control, the probability of actually hitting the aircraft was dismally low. Studies conducted by the U.S. Navy in late 1944 suggested that ships were expending an average of 1,200 rounds of 5-inch ammunition for every aircraft destroyed. Against mass kamikaze attacks, raids of 40 or 50 aircraft hitting a destroyer screen simultaneously, the numbers became impossible. Ships would exhaust their magazines long before they exhausted the attacking formations. Men would die not because American guns failed to fire, but because American shells failed to explode at the right moment. The scientists who would solve this problem weren't thinking about kamikazes in 1940. They weren't thinking about the Pacific War at all, because there wasn't one yet. But they were thinking about an aerial attack, because Britain was burning. The Blitz, Germany's sustained bombing campaign against English cities, had begun in September 1940, and British air defences were proving woefully inadequate. Anti-aircraft guns surrounding London fired thousands of shells nightly, offering the civilian population the psychological comfort of resistance, but achieving minimal actual destruction of German bombers. The British government, desperate for any technological edge, had shared its most closely guarded secret with the United States: radar. In September 1940, the Tizard mission, a British scientific delegation, arrived in Washington carrying a cavity magnetron, a device that enabled high-resolution microwave radar. It was, in the words of one American scientist, the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. The Americans reciprocated by sharing their own research, including early work on something the British found fascinating: a fuse that might use radio waves to detect when a shell was near its target. The concept wasn't new. Scientists had theorized about proximity-activated munitions since the 1920s, but theory and practice were separated by a chasm of engineering problems that seemed insurmountable. To make a proximity fuse work, you needed to miniaturize a radio transmitter and receiver small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, robust enough to survive, being fired from a gun subjecting it to accelerations of 20,000 times the force of gravity, simple enough to be manufactured by the millions, cheap enough to be disposable, and reliable enough to function after being stored for months in tropical heat or Arctic cold. You needed a power source that could sit dormant, then activate instantly and provide stable current for the few seconds of flight time. You needed electronic components that wouldn't shatter under acceleration, wouldn't corrode in salt air, wouldn't fail in temperature extremes. And you needed to accomplish all of this using vacuum tube technology, because in 1940, the transistor hadn't been invented yet. The notion of putting a working radio inside a 5-inch shell, with all the associated circuitry, seemed to many engineers like fantasy. But in June 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, Section T of the National Defense Research Committee, a group of physicists and engineers recruited from universities and private laboratories, began serious development of what they codenamed the VT fuse. The designation was deliberately misleading. VT stood for variable time, suggesting merely an improvement on conventional timed fuses. In reality, the device used radio frequency energy to detect proximity to a target, a technology so revolutionary that even its operating principle was classified. The development team faced extraordinary pressure. By late 1941, with America's entry into the war appearing inevitable, the military made clear that they needed a working fuse not in years, but in months. The team, working primarily at the National Bureau of Standards, the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, and eventually a purpose-built facility in Maryland, attacked every component of the problem simultaneously. They developed rugged vacuum tubes with elements so small and tightly wound that they could survive gun launch. They created batteries using reserve electrolytes that would activate only when the shell spun, mixing the chemicals through centrifugal force. They designed a miniature transmitter that would send out radio pulses and a receiver that would detect the reflected signal bouncing back from a nearby aircraft. When the reflection indicated the shell was within lethal distance, approximately 70 feet, an amplifier would trigger the detonator. By August 1942, 14 months into development, the team had a working prototype. The first live test occurred at the Dahlgren Naval Proving Ground in Virginia. A 5-inch shell equipped with the experimental fuse was fired at a drone aircraft. The shell exploded precisely as it passed the target. The drone disintegrated. The observers, including senior Navy officers who had been deeply skeptical of the entire project, stood in stunned silence. One officer reportedly said, "Gentlemen, we just changed naval warfare." But changing warfare and deploying the change were different challenges entirely. The fuse worked, but it was extraordinarily complex. Each unit contained over 200 individual components. Producing them in meaningful quantities would require retooling factories, training workers, and establishing quality control for a device where a single faulty resistor could mean the difference between a killed aircraft and a dead gun crew. More critically, the fuse's very effectiveness made it dangerous to use. If even one unexploded round fell into enemy hands, particularly German hands, their scientists could reverse engineer the technology within months. The Germans already led the world in radar and radio technology. Giving them access to a working proximity fuse might eliminate the Allied advantage before it could be properly exploited. In June 1943, Secretary of War Henry Stimson received a memo from Vannevar Bush, Director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, outlining the problem in stark terms. The VT fuse had the potential to revolutionize anti-aircraft warfare, potentially increasing kill probabilities by a factor of 10 or more, but its use had to be restricted. Bush recommended that the fuse be used only by the Navy, over water, where unexploded. Shells would sink and could never be recovered. It should not, under any circumstances, be used by ground forces in Europe, where even a single dud might fall into German-controlled territory. The restriction was approved. Through 1943 and most of 1944, the proximity fuse remained one of America's most closely guarded secrets, more restricted in its distribution than information about the Manhattan Project. The men who loaded the shells onto ships weren't told how they worked. The gun crews who fired them were instructed only that these were special rounds with improved reliability. Shore facilities that assembled the fuses operated under security so tight that workers in one section of a factory often had no idea what workers in another section were building. The fuse designation VT appeared on shipping manifests and inventory lists, maintaining the fiction that these were simply variable time fuses, an incremental improvement over existing technology rather than a revolutionary leap. The weapon's first major test came not in the Pacific, but in Europe, and not against aircraft, but against a different kind of terror weapon. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched its last great offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. By late December, with Allied forces recovering from the initial shock and beginning their counterattack, a new threat emerged. German Von flying bombs, crude pulse jet-powered missiles loaded with explosives, began targeting the Belgian port of Antwerp, through which most Allied supplies flowed. These weren't precision weapons. They were terror weapons, buzzing across the sky at 350 miles per hour before their engines cut out and they plummeted onto whatever happened to be below. Conventional anti-aircraft fire had proven largely ineffective. The V-1s flew too fast, too low, and too unpredictably for timed fuses to work reliably. In a carefully calculated decision, Allied commanders authorized the use of VT-fused anti-aircraft rounds against the V-1s. The weapons were being used over Allied-controlled territory. True, but the risk was deemed acceptable because the V-1s themselves were unmanned. Even if a German recovery team found an unexploded VT round, the benefit of stopping the flying bombs outweighed the risk of technological compromise. The results were immediate and dramatic. Gun batteries equipped with VT fuses achieved kill rates 5 times higher than those using conventional ammunition. The buzzing terror that had plagued Antwerp through late December was substantially reduced by mid-January. But more importantly, the weapon had been proven in combat under difficult conditions. It was this proof that would matter 3 months later, when American ships sailed toward Okinawa and into the largest sustained kamikaze assault in history. The invasion of Okinawa, codenamed Operation Iceberg, began on April 1, 1945. The island, less than 400 miles from the Japanese home islands, was the last stepping stone before an invasion of Japan itself. Both sides understood the stakes. The Japanese High Command had committed to a defense strategy called Ketsu-go, decisive battle, which prioritized inflicting such horrific casualties on American forces that the United States might negotiate a conditional surrender rather than proceed with an invasion of the mainland. The primary weapon in this strategy was the kamikaze. The Japanese had assembled every flyable aircraft they could find, trainers, obsolete fighters, even reconnaissance planes, and organized them into suicide units. Over 2,800 aircraft, many flown by pilots with barely 50 hours of flight time, were fueled, armed, and designated for one-way missions. The targets weren't battleships or carriers deep in the formation, but the destroyers and destroyer escorts that formed the radar picket lines around the invasion fleet. These smaller ships, stationed 15 to 30 miles from the main body, served as early warning systems. They were also exposed, often alone or in pairs, with relatively light anti-aircraft armament compared to capital ships. The Japanese correctly calculated that sinking or crippling these radar pickets would blind the American fleet, making the larger vessels vulnerable to follow-up attacks. The first major kamikaze assault came on April 6th, 6 days after the initial landings. 355 aircraft participated in coordinated attacks across multiple picket stations. In a single day, 13 American ships were hit, 3 were sunk, and over 700 sailors were killed or wounded. The destroyer, USS Bush, stationed at Radar Picket Station 1, was struck by 3 separate kamikazes within 30 minutes and sank with heavy casualties. Her companion, the USS Colquhoun, was hit so many times that her survivors couldn't accurately count the impacts before she went down. As night fell on April 6th, the shocked American fleet counted the cost. The kamikaze threat wasn't an occasional desperation tactic anymore. It was a systematic campaign that threatened the entire operation's viability. In the ready rooms and wardrooms across the fleet, officers faced an uncomfortable question. At this rate of losses, could the fleet sustain its operations long enough for ground forces to secure the island? The next 10 days answered that question with blood. Kamikazes hit ships daily, sometimes multiple ships on a single picket station. The destroyer Leutze, the minesweeper Defense, the destroyer escort Whitehurst, the names piled up. Gun crews stood at their stations for hours, sometimes days, in a state of exhaustion-tinged terror, watching radar contacts resolve into aircraft that might be friendly patrol planes or might be someone's 20-year-old son, intent on dying in flames to take you with him. But amid the carnage, something was changing. Ships equipped with the latest 5-inch ammunition shells, marked simply with the designation VT, were achieving dramatically higher kill rates than ships using conventional rounds. Where before it might take 100 or more shells to down a single attacking aircraft, ships with proximity fuses were destroying kamikazes with 20 rounds, 15, sometimes 10. The fuse was doing exactly what its designers had promised. It was exploding at the optimal distance from the target, creating a lethal sphere of fragmentation that didn't require a direct hit. Gun crews didn't know why these special shells worked better, only that they did, but the officers responsible for ammunition distribution noticed. By mid-April, every available VT-fused round was being rushed to the Okinawa theatre. The 5-inch guns aboard destroyers, destroyer escorts, and cruisers became the primary defense against the kamikaze waves. The standard combat load for a destroyer included about 1,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. By late April, ships at the radar picket stations were being resupplied exclusively with VT-fused rounds. The illegal technology still classified, still restricted, still so secret that the men firing it daily had no idea how it functioned, had become the fleet's primary hope for survival. The technical specifications of the VT fuse reveal why it was so effective and why its development represented such an extraordinary achievement. The Mark 32 fuse, the version used in 5-inch naval ammunition, measured just under 4 inches in length and weighed less than 2 pounds. Inside that compact cylinder, engineers had managed to fit a complete radio system. A miniature vacuum tube transmitter sent out radio frequency pulses at approximately 180 MHz, roughly the frequency of modern FM radio. These pulses radiated outward in a cone-shaped pattern ahead of the shell. When the shell passed near an aircraft, the pulses reflected back, picked up by a receiver circuit in the same fuse. As the shell closed on the target, the strength of the reflected signal increased. When that signal reached a predetermined threshold corresponding to a distance of approximately 70 feet, an amplifier triggered the detonator, and the shell's explosive charge converted into thousands of high-velocity fragments. The genius lay in the details. The vacuum tube, designed specifically for this application, had elements so small they could barely be seen without magnification, yet robust enough to survive accelerations that would crush conventional electronics. The battery system used a clever design. An ampule of electrolyte acid sat separate from the battery plates until the moment of firing. When the gun fired and the shell began to spin, centrifugal force shattered the ampule, allowing the acid to mix with the plates and generate current. This meant the battery had an effectively infinite shelf life. It couldn't corrode or discharge because it wasn't actually a battery until the shell was in flight. The fuse also incorporated a safety mechanism. It wouldn't arm until the shell had spun a certain number of rotations, ensuring it couldn't detonate in the gun barrel or immediately after leaving the muzzle. And perhaps most remarkably, the entire assembly was designed to be manufactured by workers with no specialized electronics training, using mass production techniques in factories across America. By April 1945, production had ramped to extraordinary levels. Western Electric, Eastman, Kodak, Philco, Sylvania, and more than 40 other companies were producing proximity fuses, turning out over 60,000 units daily. The fuses were shipped in specially designed containers that protected them from shock and moisture during the long journey to forward bases in the Pacific. From there, they were transferred to ammunition ships that accompanied the fleet and finally loaded into the magazines of destroyers and cruisers operating off Okinawa. The logistics were staggering. Keeping the radar picket destroyers supplied with VT ammunition meant constant replenishment runs by ammunition ships, often conducted under threat of air attack themselves. A destroyer that had expended 800 rounds during a day of heavy action would be resupplied that night, its crew forming human chains to pass the heavy shells from the supply ship's deck, down passageways, through hatches, into the magazine spaces deep in the ship's hull. The shells were identical in appearance to conventional high-explosive rounds, except for the distinctive shape of the fuse itself, slightly more bulbous than a standard mechanical fuse, and the VT marking stenciled on each crate. The gunners who loaded and fired these rounds developed an almost superstitious reverence for them. Fire Controlman 3rd Class Robert Bates, serving aboard the destroyer USS Hazelwood during the Okinawa campaign, later recalled, "We called them the magic shells. We didn't know how they worked. Some guys thought they homed in on the target like a torpedo. Others figured they had some kind of timing device that was more accurate than the regular fuses. All we knew was that when we loaded VT rounds and when we saw the bursts in the air, aircraft came apart. The black puffs from regular shells, you'd see them bloom way off to the side or above or below the target. But the VT bursts, they wrapped around the plane like someone grabbed it and squeezed. This wasn't imagination or wishful thinking. The data supported what the gunners were seeing. Analysis conducted by the Navy's Operations Research Group in May 1945 showed that 5-inch guns using conventional ammunition were achieving approximately 1 aircraft destroyed for every 450 rounds fired. The same guns using VT-fused ammunition were destroying aircraft with an average of 150 rounds. The effectiveness had tripled. In practical terms, this meant a destroyer that might have shot down 2 attacking aircraft with its conventional ammunition load could now expect to shoot down 6 or 7 with VT fuses. Against mass kamikaze attacks, that difference wasn't marginal, it was existential. The morning of April 12th brought the largest kamikaze assault yet. Nearly 400 aircraft launched from bases across Kyushu, organized into waves that would strike the radar picket lines throughout the day. The destroyer, USS Manert L. Abele, stationed at Radar Picket Station 14 with the destroyer escort USS Jeffers, detected the first inbound contacts shortly after noon. The 2 ships went to general quarters, their crews rushing to battle stations with the practiced urgency that had become routine over 11 days of nearly continuous combat. The fire control directors locked onto the nearest contacts, a formation of 4 aircraft approaching from the northeast at 8,000 feet. The 5-inch guns of both ships opened fire, their VT-fused shells reaching out toward the attackers. The first aircraft disintegrated in a bright flash 7,000 yards from the Abele. The second veered away, trailing smoke, and crashed into the sea. The third pressed its attack, diving toward the Jeffers, and was destroyed by a direct burst from her forward gun mount at 2,000 yards. The 4th aircraft, a Mitsubishi Zero carrying a single bomb, managed to evade the fire long enough to crash into the Abele's starboard side amidships. The explosion tore open the ship's hull and ignited fires in the forward engine room. As the Abele's damage control parties fought the flames and flooding, radar detected another contact, this one approaching at high speed and low altitude. The contact was unlike anything the radar operators had seen. It was moving at over 500 miles per hour, faster than any conventional aircraft they'd encountered. What they were tracking was an Oka, a piloted rocket-powered bomb dropped from a bomber aircraft and guided to the target by a suicide pilot in a final, supersonic dive. The Oka slammed into the Abele's port side aft, its explosive warhead detonating against the ship's thin hull. The combined damage from both impacts was catastrophic. The Abele broke in half and sank within 5 minutes, taking 84 men with her. The Jeffers, herself damaged by a near-miss bomb, could only rescue survivors as more contacts appeared on her radar scope. The loss of the Abele shocked the fleet, but the engagement also demonstrated something crucial. The VT fuses had worked exactly as designed. Of the 4 conventional aircraft in the initial attack, 3 had been destroyed before reaching effective range. The 4th aircraft that hit the ship had only succeeded because it was part of a coordinated attack that split the defenders' fire. The Oka, traveling at speeds far beyond what conventional fuses could handle, represented a weapon against which proximity fuses offered little advantage, but Okas were rare. The Navy had fewer than 50 of them. The real threat remained conventional aircraft flown by determined pilots, and against those, the VT fuse was proving devastatingly effective. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Over the next month, The pattern repeated across dozens of engagements. The destroyer USS Laffey, stationed at Radar Picket Station 1 on April 16th, fought off 22 separate kamikaze attacks in 80 minutes, using VT fuses almost exclusively. She was hit by 5 kamikazes and 4 bombs, but her gun crews firing continuously until their barrels glowed red claimed to have destroyed 9 attacking aircraft. The destroyer survived, a battered testimony to both the effectiveness of the proximity fuse and the extraordinary courage of sailors who kept firing even as their ship burned around them. The destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley and the destroyer escort USS Evans, stationed together at Radar Picket Station 15 on May 11th, engaged more than 50 aircraft over a 2-hour period. Between them, they claimed 23 aircraft destroyed, nearly all with 5-inch VT-fused ammunition. Both ships were ultimately hit and damaged, but they survived, and their action prevented the attacking force from reaching the transports and capital ships behind them. The Japanese pilots noticed the change. Intelligence reports gathered from interrogations of captured pilots and from translated documents recovered after the war revealed that Japanese commanders had begun warning their kamikaze units about increased American anti-aircraft effectiveness. One report from late April 1945, captured at an airfield on Kyushu after the war, included this assessment. Enemy anti-aircraft fire has become notably more accurate since early April. Shells are observed to burst in close proximity to our aircraft with greater frequency than before. Pilots are advised to approach at extremely low altitude, where possible to minimize exposure to medium-caliber fire. The Japanese didn't know about the proximity fuse they attributed the increased effectiveness to, improved radar fire control or better training, but they recognized that something had changed, that the odds of reaching a target had decreased significantly. Some Japanese tactical reports recommended approaching at wave-top altitude, where the proximity fuse's effectiveness was reduced because the signal would reflect off the water surface as well as the aircraft, potentially causing premature detonation. But flying that low meant running a gauntlet of smaller caliber weapons, the 40mm and 20mm guns that formed the close-in defense of every American ship. Either way, the kamikazes faced a killing zone that had become measurably more lethal. The statistics compiled by the Navy after the battle tell the story in stark numbers. During the Okinawa campaign, from April 1st through June 30th, 1945, American ships fired approximately 275,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. Of those, approximately 125,000 were VT-fused rounds. Those VT rounds were credited with destroying or assisting in the destruction of approximately 352 Japanese aircraft. The conventional ammunition, while still valuable for surface targets and suppressive fire, accounted for significantly fewer aircraft destroyed. The proximity fuse hadn't just improved American anti-aircraft capability, it had fundamentally altered the tactical equation. Ships that in earlier campaigns might have been overwhelmed and sunk were now surviving, damaged but afloat. Gun crews that might have fired until their magazines were empty without scoring a single kill were now destroying multiple attackers. The technology that had been deemed too secret to use over land, too valuable to risk compromising, had proven itself the single most effective anti-aircraft weapon in the American arsenal. But the fuse's effectiveness came at a cost that went beyond the extraordinary expense and manufacturing effort required to produce millions of units. Each VT fuse cost approximately $28 to manufacture in 1945 dollars, equivalent to roughly $500 today. A single 5-inch shell, loaded with a proximity fuse, represented a significant investment in materials, labor, and technological sophistication. The Navy was effectively firing small radio stations at aircraft, and each shot that missed was $28 of electronics falling into the ocean. During the peak of the Okinawa campaign, destroyers on radar picket duty were firing hundreds of these rounds daily. The USS Laffey alone expended more than 600 VT-fused rounds during her single 80-minute engagement on April 16. At $28 each, that represented nearly $17,000 in fuses alone, not counting the shells themselves, the propellant charges, or the wear on the guns. Across the entire fleet, over the 3-month Okinawa campaign, the VT fuses fired represented an investment of more than $3.5 million, an enormous sum for 1945. But when measured against the alternative ships sunk, sailors killed, operations delayed or abandoned, the cost was justified. Every destroyer saved, every transport that reached shore intact, every carrier that could continue launching aircraft represented far more than $3.5 million in material value, to say nothing of the lives preserved. The proximity fuse's success at Okinawa also forced a strategic recalculation within the Japanese High Command. By late May, with the Kamikaze campaign having failed to stop the American advance, Japanese planners recognized that their decisive battle strategy wasn't working. Despite throwing thousands of aircraft at the invasion fleet, despite achieving dozens of hits and sinking several ships, they hadn't inflicted casualties on a scale that would make the Americans reconsider their advance toward Japan itself. The proximity fuse wasn't solely responsible for this failure. American fighter patrols, improved radar coordination, and the sheer depth of American material resources all played crucial roles. But the dramatic improvement in anti-aircraft effectiveness removed one of Japan's few remaining tactical advantages. The Kamikaze had been terrifying not just because of its psychological impact, but because it represented an asymmetric weapon. A cheap, obsolete aircraft and a poorly trained pilot could, if they reached the target, sink a ship worth millions of dollars and crewed by hundreds of trained sailors. The proximity fuse restored balance to that equation. Now, reaching the target required surviving a defensive umbrella so effective that only a small percentage of attacking aircraft could penetrate it. The human cost of the Okinawa campaign, even with the proximity fuse's effectiveness, remained staggering. The Navy suffered nearly 5,000 killed, and an equal number wounded, the highest casualties the Navy would sustain in any single battle of the war. 34 ships were sunk, and more than 360 were damaged. But analysis conducted after the war suggested that without the proximity fuse, casualties might have been 50% higher. Ships that survived because their gun crews destroyed attacking aircraft before they could impact would instead have been hit, perhaps sunk. The radar picket destroyers exposed, isolated, and subjected to repeated attacks might have been overwhelmed entirely, blinding the fleet and exposing the heavier units to catastrophic losses. The proximity fuse hadn't made anti-aircraft warfare bloodless or easy, but it had made it survivable. It had given American sailors a weapon that matched their courage with effectiveness, that turned determination into results, that meant hours of standing at battle stations in fear and exhaustion could actually protect the ship rather than simply offering the illusion of defense. By June 1945, as organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa collapsed and the campaign entered its final phase, the proximity fuse had been in combat use for 5 months. The initial restrictions on its deployment, the insistence that it only be used over water, the fears about technological compromise had been proven both wise and, ultimately, successful. Despite firing more than 100,000 VT-fused rounds, not a single intact fuse fell into Japanese hands in a condition that would allow reverse engineering. Shells that failed to detonate either sank in deep water or, in the few cases where they fell on land, had been damaged by impact to the point where their circuitry was unrecognizable. The Japanese knew the Americans had developed some improved form of anti-aircraft ammunition. The results were too dramatic to attribute to chance, but they never determined the operating principle. Japanese scientists and engineers, occupied with their own desperate attempts to develop guided missiles, radar-equipped night fighters, and other defensive technologies, never replicated the proximity fuse. The technology remained an American and British secret throughout the war's remainder. The fuse's final evolution came in the war's last weeks. By August 1945, with plans for the invasion of Japan itself under active preparation, military planners were considering using proximity fuses in a role never originally intended, against ground targets. Artillery shells equipped with VT fuses could be set to detonate at a predetermined height above ground, creating an airburst effect that was far more lethal against infantry in trenches or behind cover than conventional ground-burst explosions. Tests conducted in the Pacific demonstrated dramatic improvements in the radius of casualties compared to standard high-explosive shells. The invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, was expected to be horrifically costly, with projections of American casualties running into the hundreds of thousands. Every weapon that might reduce those casualties was being evaluated. The VT fuse, initially developed to shoot down aircraft, was being repurposed to support ground assault troops in what would have been the largest and bloodiest amphibious operation in history. But the invasion never came. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The proximity fuse would never be used in the ground assault role for which it was being prepared. The secret weapon had remained secret just long enough. In the decades after the war, as classified files were gradually declassified, and participants began writing their memoirs and analyses, the proximity fuse emerged as one of the war's most significant technological achievements. Its development timeline from concept to combat deployment in less than 3 years represented a remarkable feat of engineering and manufacturing coordination. Its effectiveness, tripling the hit probability of anti-aircraft fire, represented a genuine revolution in naval warfare. And its security remaining secret despite being fired in combat more than 1 million times represented a triumph of operational security. Historians and military analysts have debated the relative importance of various technologies in determining World War II's outcome. The atomic bomb ended the war, certainly. Radar won the Battle of Britain and the Battle of the Atlantic. Code breaking shortened the war by months or years. But the proximity fuse kept ships afloat and sailors alive during the Pacific War's final, desperate campaigns. It turned Okinawa from a potential disaster into a costly but decisive victory. It made the naval blockade of Japan sustainable. And it demonstrated that technological superiority, when properly applied, could offset numerical disadvantage and suicidal determination. The men who developed the proximity fuse received little recognition during the war itself. The weapons classification meant that scientists like Merle Tuve, who led the development effort at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, couldn't publish their work or discuss it publicly. Engineers who had solved unprecedented technical challenges, miniaturizing vacuum tubes, designing batteries that activated on demand, creating receivers sensitive enough to detect reflected radio waves yet robust enough to survive gun launch, remained anonymous. The workers in factories across America who assembled the fuses, many of them women who had entered industrial work for the first time during the war, had no idea that the devices they were building represented one of the most sophisticated pieces of technology in the Allied arsenal. They knew only that the work was classified, that the components had to meet exacting specifications, and that the fuses they produced were being shipped somewhere overseas. The secrecy persisted even after Japan's surrender. While other wartime technologies quickly became public knowledge, radar, proximity fuses remained classified until 1952, 7 years after the war's end. When the classification was finally lifted, the scientific and engineering community recognized the achievement for what it was, a masterpiece of applied physics and practical engineering. The challenges that had been overcome, making electronics survive 20,000 G accelerations, creating reliable radio circuits smaller than anything previously attempted, mass-producing precision instruments by the millions, had required innovations that would influence electronics development for decades. The techniques developed for miniaturizing vacuum tubes informed later work on transistors. The quality control methods implemented to ensure fuse reliability became models for manufacturing complex electronic systems. The integration of multiple technologies, radio, explosives, mechanical systems, power sources into a single disposable unit, anticipated the integrated systems approach that would dominate military technology in the second half of the 20th century. In 1957, the proximity fuse was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. Merle Tuve, who had directed the development effort, received the Presidential Medal of Merit. But by then, the technology itself was already obsolete, superseded by guided missiles and more sophisticated fire control systems. Yet the fuse's legacy extended far beyond its immediate military application. The development process had demonstrated that with sufficient resources, coordination, and urgency, seemingly impossible engineering challenges could be solved in remarkably short timeframes. The Proximity Fuse project served as a template for later crash development programs, including the ballistic missile programs of the 1950s and the space program of the 1960s. It showed that university researchers, private industry, and government could collaborate effectively when given clear objectives and adequate funding. It proved that mass production of highly complex devices was possible if quality control was treated as seriously as quantity. And it validated the concept of operational secrecy, that a weapon could be used extensively in combat without the enemy discovering how it worked, provided security measures were rigorous and personnel understood the importance of maintaining silence. The individual stories of those who experienced the proximity fuse's effectiveness remained largely untold for years after the war. Sailors like James Fahey, the radar operator aboard the USS Montpelier, returned home with memories of kamikaze attacks, of watching aircraft disintegrate in black bursts of fragmenting steel, but with no understanding of what made those bursts so deadly. Fire controlman Robert Bates, who had called them magic shells, left the Navy in 1946 and wouldn't learn how the VT fuses actually worked until reading a declassified account in a magazine in the 1950s. For these men, and thousands like them, the proximity fuse existed in memory as a weapon that had worked when they desperately needed it to work, that had given them a chance to survive when survival had seemed unlikely. The technical details mattered less than the lived experience. The fuse had been there, it had functioned, and they had come home. The Japanese perspective on the proximity fuse emerged slowly, pieced together from post-war interrogations, captured documents, and eventually from the accounts of surviving Japanese pilots and officers willing to discuss their experiences. They had noticed the increased effectiveness of American anti-aircraft fire during the Okinawa campaign, but most attributed it to improved radar fire control or better coordination between ships, rather than to a revolutionary new fuse design. Some Japanese reports noted that American shell bursts seemed to occur with suspicious accuracy near attacking aircraft, but without access to an intact fuse, Japanese analysts could only speculate. One interrogation report from 1946 recorded the testimony of a Japanese naval aviation officer who had survived the war. "We believed the Americans had perfected their radar-directed fire control to a degree we could not match. We did not know they had developed a shell that could sense the presence of aircraft. Had we known, I'm not sure it would have changed our tactics. By April of 1945, we had few options remaining. The kamikaze was not a choice, but a necessity." This statement captures the tragic calculus of the Pacific War's final phase. Japan had committed to a strategy that depended on overwhelming American defenses through sheer numbers and willingness to die, while America had deployed a technology that made that strategy mathematically unsustainable. The proximity fuse also played a role in the strategic deliberations that led to the atomic bomb's use. When President Harry Truman and his advisors evaluated options for ending the war with Japan, one consideration was the projected cost of continuing conventional operations. The invasion of Japan, scheduled for November 1945, was expected to involve millions of troops and result in catastrophic casualties on both sides. But even if the invasion could be delayed or avoided, maintaining the naval blockade and continuing air operations required keeping ships on station near Japan, where they remained vulnerable to attack. The Okinawa campaign had shown that even with technological advantages like the proximity fuse, naval operations near Japan entailed severe losses. Every week the war continued meant more ships damaged, more sailors killed, more aircraft expended. The proximity fuse had made these operations survivable, but it hadn't made them cheap or casualty-free. When the atomic bomb offered a way to potentially force surrender without invasion or extended blockade, the decision to use it was influenced in part by the desire to avoid repeating Okinawa on a larger scale. The proximity fuse had saved lives at Okinawa, but the atomic bomb, its advocates argued, would save even more by ending the war entirely. History has debated that decision endlessly, but the tactical reality was clear. Even with superior technology, conventional operations against a determined enemy defending their homeland remained brutally costly. In the broader sweep of military history, the proximity fuse represents a particular type of innovation, the force multiplier that operates invisibly. Unlike tanks or aircraft carriers or bombers, weapons whose power is immediately visible and intuitively understood, the proximity fuse was hidden inside conventional-looking shells. Its revolution was internal, electronic, invisible to everyone except those who experienced its effects. This invisibility proved to be both an advantage and a limitation. The advantage was security. The Japanese never fully understood what they were facing. The limitation was recognition. Because the fuse worked inside a shell that looked like any other shell, its contribution to victory was easy to overlook or underestimate. Post-war assessments of crucial technologies tended to emphasize the dramatic, the atomic bomb, the B-29 bomber, the aircraft carrier, while the proximity fuse, despite its demonstrated effectiveness, remained less celebrated outside specialist circles. Yet for the sailors who served on the radar picket lines off Okinawa, the fuse's importance needed no emphasis. The USS Laffey, which survived 5 kamikaze impacts and 4 bomb hits on April 16, 1945, was kept afloat by damage control teams working in flooded compartments and by gun crews who never stopped firing. But she was also kept afloat by the proximity-fused shells that destroyed aircraft before they could hit, which reduced the number of impacts from what might have been fatal to what was merely crippling. The ship returned to the United States in June 1945, was repaired, and remained in service until 1975. She is now a museum ship in Charleston, South Carolina. Visitors who tour her can see the battle scars, repaired hull plates where kamikazes struck, replaced sections where fires burned. What they can't see are the aircraft that didn't hit her, the attacks that were broken up by accurately bursting shells, the lives saved by electronics and physics working together inside 5-inch projectiles. Those victories are invisible, preserved only in after-action reports and the memories of men now mostly gone. The ethics of the proximity fuse received little attention at the time and not much more since. It was, after all, a defensive weapon, designed to shoot down attacking aircraft before they could kill sailors. Unlike area bombing or submarine warfare or the atomic bomb, it raised no significant moral questions. It made anti-aircraft fire more effective, nothing more. Yet there is something worth noting about the asymmetry it created. The proximity fuse was expensive, technologically sophisticated, and required an enormous industrial base to produce. It represented the advantage wealthy, industrialized nations held over poorer ones. Japan, for all its determination and tactical innovation, could never have developed and mass-produced proximity fuses on the scale America did. The industrial capacity didn't exist. The electronics industry wasn't sufficiently developed. The scientific infrastructure wasn't there. In this sense, the proximity fuse exemplified how World War II became, Increasingly, a war decided by manufacturing capacity and technological sophistication rather than by valor or tactical brilliance. The kamikaze pilots were brave, suicidally brave, but their courage couldn't overcome the material reality of American industrial and scientific superiority. The proximity fuse turned that superiority into lethal effectiveness. In the decades after 1945, proximity fuse technology continued to evolve. Modern versions use solid-state electronics instead of vacuum tubes, incorporate multiple detection methods including laser and radar, and can be programmed for specific burst heights or proximity distances. They're used in everything from anti-aircraft missiles to artillery shells to grenades. The basic principle detect, proximity to target, detonate at optimal distance remains unchanged, but the execution has become far more sophisticated. Yet, the original VT fuse, with its spinning battery and miniature vacuum tube, remains a remarkable achievement precisely because of its constraints. The engineers of 1941 through 1943 had to invent solutions without the benefit of transistors, integrated circuits, or modern manufacturing techniques. They succeeded through ingenuity, persistence, and an acceptance that some problems are so important they must be solved regardless of difficulty. The proximity fuse emerged from necessity, was perfected through urgency, and deployed with the kind of security that seems almost impossible in an age of instant communication and ubiquitous surveillance. The final irony of the proximity fuse story is this: the weapon that was deemed too secret to use over land for fear of compromise, the technology whose very existence was denied for years after the war, ended up being one of the most fired American weapons of World War II. More than 1 million proximity-fused rounds were expended during the war, the vast majority in the Pacific Theater. Of those, 125,000 were fired at Okinawa alone. Each firing was a calculated risk. Will this shell fail to detonate and fall into enemy hands? Will this engagement reveal enough about the weapon's capabilities to allow reverse engineering? The answer, remarkably, was always no. The security held, the secret kept, and thousands of sailors lived who might otherwise have died. The proximity fuse's story isn't as dramatic as the Manhattan Project's race to build an atomic bomb, or as straightforward as the development of radar or code breaking. It's the story of an invisible technology, a hidden advantage, a weapon that worked precisely because its enemies never understood why it worked so well. James Fahey, the radar operator who watched those green blips approach his ship day after day during the Okinawa campaign, survived the war and wrote a memoir based on his wartime diary. Published in 1963, Pacific War Diary became one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of the naval war from an enlisted man's perspective. In it, he describes the constant fear of kamikaze attack, the exhaustion of weeks at battle stations, the relief when attacking aircraft were destroyed before reaching their targets. He writes about the VT-fused shells without understanding what made them work. Our new ammunition is really something. The guns hardly ever miss now. That simple statement, written by a man who never knew about miniature vacuum tubes or reflected radio waves, or the Manhattan Project-level secrecy surrounding the weapon that saved his life, captures the proximity fuse's ultimate success. It worked. It worked reliably, repeatedly, under the most stressful combat conditions imaginable, and the men who depended on it noticed, even if they didn't understand. The morning of April 16, 1945, the morning James Fahey watched those radar contacts approach, the morning the USS Laffey fought off 22 kamikaze attacks, the morning that would become one of the most intense anti-aircraft actions in naval history, began like dozens of other mornings that spring. General quarters before dawn, coffee and a quick breakfast at battle stations, eyes scanning the sky and radar screens for the contacts that would inevitably come. But this morning was different because of something invisible, something spinning inside thousands of 5-inch shells stacked in the magazines below. Miniature radio stations, armed and ready, waiting to sense the presence of aircraft and convert that sensing into explosive force. The sailors didn't know about the radios. The Japanese pilots diving toward the ships didn't know about them. But they worked anyway, expanding the killing radius of anti-aircraft fire from a few feet to 70 feet, from direct hit or nothing to close enough counts. That expansion, measured in yards, translated into hundreds of aircraft destroyed, dozens of ships saved, thousands of lives preserved. An invisible technology, working invisibly, making the difference between catastrophe and survival. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.